The air in Napa Valley always smelled like crushed grapes, sun-baked earth, and old money. It was a heavy, intoxicating scent that drew tourists by the millions, all of them desperate for a taste of the elegant California dream. But to me, that smell did not represent luxury or relaxation. To me, it just smelled like a perfectly curated, incredibly expensive lie. My name is Aveline Kingsford. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end. I am 36 years old, and for the past decade, I have built a highly successful career as a commercial real estate underwriter. My entire professional life revolves around tearing apart financial illusions. I spend my days digging through glossy portfolios, exposing hidden liabilities, and finding the quiet, insidious rot that wealthy developers try so desperately to hide. I am trained to look past the beautiful facade and find the ugly truth buried in the paperwork. Today, however, the crumbling empire I was about to meticulously dismantle did not belong to a nameless corporate client. It belonged to my own parents. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my dark, heavily armored but visually unassuming SUV. The winding, tree-lined roads of the valley blurred past the windows as we approached the imposing iron gates of the Kingsford estate. In the passenger seat next to me sat Elias Bradley. At 45, Elias possessed the kind of sharp, observant stillness that made most people instantly nervous. To my family, he was simply going to be introduced as my quiet, distinguished +1 for the weekend. In reality, Elias was an independent financial investigator for the state, and the thick leather briefcase resting at his feet contained enough explosive legal documentation to shatter my family's generational wealth into a million unrecoverable pieces. "Are you doing okay, Mom?" The soft, fiercely protective voice came from the back seat. I glanced in the rearview mirror and met the eyes of my 17-year-old daughter, Harper. Even at her young age, Harper possessed a profound emotional intelligence that often left me breathless. She had inherited my dark hair and my sharp jawline, but more importantly, she had inherited my absolute refusal to be a victim. Sitting right next to her, completely engrossed in a quiet coloring book, was my 7-year-old adopted son, Oliver. He was wearing a simple, comfortable blue button-down shirt that he had proudly picked out all by himself that morning. He was a sweet, deeply sensitive boy who had already endured too much trauma before I finalized his adoption 2 years ago. He did not know that we were driving into an active emotional war zone. He just thought we were going to a party. "I'm perfectly fine, Harper," I replied, offering her a steady, reassuring smile in the mirror. "Just remember what we talked about. We are not here to argue today. We are just here to observe." Harper nodded, her jaw setting into a firm, stubborn line. She knew the history. She knew the quiet family pain that had haunted my entire existence. In a highly toxic family structure, there is always a designated golden child, and there is always a designated scapegoat. I was the scapegoat. For 36 years, I was the emotional dumping ground for my parents' insecurities. The abuse I suffered growing up wasn't loud. It wasn't physical violence or screaming matches that the neighbors could hear. It was far more insidious than that. It was the quiet, agonizing pain of constant exclusion. It was the subtle rolling of eyes, the heavy sighs of disappointment, and the icy silence that fell over the dinner table whenever I dared to share a personal achievement. The dynamic fractured permanently 17 years ago. When I became unexpectedly pregnant with Harper at the fragile age of 19, my parents did not rally around me with love or support. My father, Ronan, looked at me with unadulterated disgust, his face pale with the terrifying thought of what his wealthy country club friends might say. My mother, Vivian, wept dramatically, not for my fear or my overwhelming vulnerability, but for her own ruined social standing. They allowed me to sleep in my childhood bedroom, but that was the absolute limit of their generosity. They weaponized my pregnancy, using it as eternal proof that I was inherently flawed. While I was recovering from a grueling emergency C-section, I was simultaneously working 3 exhausting minimum wage jobs just to pay them back for the hospital bills. I bought cheap formula and secondhand clothes for Harper, crying silently in the dark out of sheer exhaustion. Meanwhile, my younger sister, Seraphine, the undisputed golden child of the Kingsford family, was living a life of absolute unearned privilege. When Seraphine turned 18 and managed to get accepted into a deeply average private university, paid for entirely in cash by my father, she was gifted a brand new luxury sports car with a giant red bow on the hood. The contrast was not just unfair, it was violently cruel. I was the cautionary tale. Seraphine was the shining trophy. But pain is a remarkable teacher. I did not break under the crushing weight of their rejection. I used it as fuel. I put myself through night school, earned my degrees with honors, and ruthlessly clawed my way up the corporate ladder in the male-dominated world of commercial finance. I built my own wealth quietly, methodically, and entirely without their help. They still thought of me as the pathetic, struggling teenage mother. They had absolutely no idea who I had become or the immense financial power I now wielded. "Turn left at the next stone marker," Elias said quietly, breaking me out of my dark reverie. His deep voice was completely calm, anchoring me back to the present moment. "The GPS shows the main gate is just ahead." "I know the way," I murmured, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. "I've memorized every single crack in this driveway." We rounded the final bend, and the sprawling Kingsford estate suddenly loomed into view. It was a massive, breathtaking Mediterranean-style villa surrounded by acres of perfectly manicured, lush green vineyards. Today was my parents' ruby anniversary. 40 years of a marriage built entirely on shallow appearances, aggressive social climbing, and financial smoke and mirrors. The wide circular driveway was already packed with luxury vehicles. I immediately spotted a gleaming, brand-new Aston Martin parked aggressively near the grand stone fountain. It belonged to Vance Sterling, Seraphine's smooth-talking 35-year-old husband. Vance was a man who styled himself as a visionary boutique hotel developer. He wore custom-tailored Italian suits, spoke entirely in empty corporate buzzwords, and possessed the arrogant swagger of a man who believed his own lies. He was the perfect addition to the Kingsford family, shiny on the outside, completely hollow on the inside. I pulled my dark SUV smoothly past the valet stand, declining their offer to park it. I chose a spot near the heavy iron exit gates, ensuring my vehicle was pointing outward. Always leave yourself a clear, unobstructed tactical exit. It was a hard lesson my childhood had taught me. "All right, everyone," I said, turning off the engine. The silence in the cabin was heavy. "We are going to go in. We are going to smile, and we are going to be perfectly polite. Let them do the talking." Elias caught my eye, a faint, knowing smirk playing on his lips. He picked up his heavy leather briefcase. "I love a good party," he noted dryly. We stepped out into the warm California sun. The air was thick with the sound of a live jazz quartet playing softly on the back terrace and the clinking of expensive crystal champagne flutes. Everything looked absolutely flawless. It was a masterpiece of social theater. As we walked up the wide stone steps toward the massive carved mahogany front doors, the grand matriarch herself appeared. My mother, Vivienne, was 60 years old but possessed the sharp, tight features of a woman who spent a small fortune desperately fighting the inevitable passage of time. She was wearing an exquisite, custom-fitted white silk dress that draped perfectly over her slender frame. A massive ruby pendant, undoubtedly a gift for the anniversary, rested heavily against her collarbone. She held a glass of sparkling rosé in one hand, playing the role of the gracious, wealthy hostess to absolute perfection. When her piercing eyes landed on me, the polite, radiant smile she had been wearing for her high society guests vanished for a fraction of a second. It was immediately replaced by her signature look, a toxic mixture of profound disappointment and barely concealed pity. She quickly recovered, pasting a bright, entirely fake smile back onto her face as she glided gracefully toward us. "Aveline, darling," Vivienne cooed, extending her free arm to offer me a stiff, air-kiss embrace that required no actual physical contact. "You actually made it, and right on time, too. I was so worried your vehicle might break down on the highway. It's so brave of you to drive such a practical, heavy thing to a sophisticated event." It was the classic Vivienne Kingsford greeting, a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She wrapped a vicious insult in the gentle, caring tone of a concerned mother. If I reacted with anger, I would look like the unstable, dramatic daughter. If I stayed silent, I absorbed the poison. "The car runs perfectly, Mother," I replied, my voice smooth, cold, and entirely unbothered. "Happy anniversary! 40 years is a remarkable endurance test." Vivienne's eyes narrowed slightly at my choice of words, but she quickly pivoted her attention to the rest of my group. Her gaze swept over Elias, taking in his tailored, conservative suit and his unreadable expression. "And who is this?" she asked, her tone shifting to an invasive, probing curiosity. "Don't tell me you finally found a man willing to take on all your baggage, Aveline. This is Elias. I introduced him smoothly, completely ignoring her venomous bait. He's my +1 for the weekend. Elias, this is my mother, Vivian. A pleasure to meet the woman who designed this magnificent estate, Elias said, offering a polite, practiced nod. He did not offer his hand to shake. He knew exactly what she was. Your reputation for curating appearances is well known. Vivian beamed, entirely missing the subtle double meaning in his words. Oh, thank you, Elias. We do take immense pride in our home. Then her eyes dropped to the children. She completely ignored Harper, who was glaring at her with barely contained teenage fury. Instead, Vivian zeroed in on my 7-year-old son, Oliver. He was clutching the hem of my dress, clearly overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the estate and the loud music. Vivian sighed dramatically, adjusting her heavy ruby pendant. She leaned down slightly, though she was careful not to get too close, as if she feared poverty might be contagious. Oliver, sweetie, Vivian said, her voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet, condescending pity. Did you pick that little shirt out all by yourself from the charity bin? It is so spirited, but perhaps next time your mother could find something a bit more muted? We have photographers from the local society magazine here today, and bright blue just severely clashes with the coastal neutral aesthetic of the terrace. Harper took a sharp, aggressive step forward, her fists clenching at her sides. I immediately shot my arm out, pressing the back of my hand firmly against Harper's chest to stop her. Not yet. I looked down at Oliver, who had shrunk back against my leg, his small face flushing with embarrassment, even though he didn't fully understand the cruel nuances of her words. I gently stroked his dark hair, offering him a warm, fiercely protective smile. Then I looked back up at my mother. I didn't yell, I didn't defend his clothes, I simply let a long, heavy, deafening silence stretch between us. I stared directly into Vivian's eyes, letting the cold, calculated emptiness of my gaze strip away her smug satisfaction. For the first time in 36 years, I wasn't looking at my mother as an authority figure to be feared. I was looking at her as a deeply pathetic, financially ruined woman who was currently standing on property she no longer owned. She just didn't know it yet. The shirt stays, Mother, I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying an undeniable, lethal weight. And trust me, by the end of this evening, the color of my son's shirt will be the absolute least of your concerns. Vivian blinked, visibly taken aback by the sheer, unyielding confidence radiating from me. She opened her mouth to snap back, to put me firmly back in my place as the family disappointment, but a loud burst of laughter from the back terrace interrupted her. Come along, Vivian huffed, recovering her haughty posture and waving her hand dismissively. Your father and Seraphine are out by the pool. Try not to cause a scene, Eveline. We are celebrating today. She turned gracefully on her expensive heels and floated away toward the party, entirely oblivious to the fact that she had just welcomed her own executioner through the front gates. Elias stepped up quietly beside me, adjusting his grip on the heavy leather briefcase containing the foreclosure documents, the wire fraud evidence, and the undeniable proof of a massive criminal conspiracy. She is exactly as you described her, Elias murmured, his eyes tracking Vivian's retreating white silk dress. She is worse, I corrected him softly. But she is also completely out of time. I took a deep breath of the heavy Napa Valley air, savoring the crisp scent of the vineyards. The illusion was flawless. The stage was perfectly set. I took Oliver's small hand in mine, gave Harper an approving nod, and stepped forward into the lion's den. It was time to burn the Kingsford Empire to the ground. I bypassed my wallet, my car keys, and the small emergency medical kit I always carried for Oliver. My fingers found exactly what I was looking for. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. The flap was tightly sealed with red tamper-evident tape, bearing the distinctive embossed logo of one of the largest commercial private equity firms on the West Coast. I held it in my hands for a brief second, feeling its substantial weight. For an entire year, I had meticulously compiled the contents of this envelope. I had worked late into the night tracing offshore routing numbers, cross-referencing shell companies, and pulling property records that had been intentionally buried beneath layers of corporate obfuscation. With a flick of my wrist, I tossed the thick envelope directly into the center of the long marble dining table. It landed with a loud, heavy thud that instantly silenced the remaining murmurs of the wealthy guests who were seated around us. The envelope slid perfectly across the smooth stone, coming to a halt right next to the shattered remains of Oliver's crystal water goblet. It sat there, an ugly, glaring blemish on Vivian's perfectly curated 40-year anniversary aesthetic. For a long moment, nobody moved. The jazz band on the terrace had finished their set, and in the eerie quiet that followed, the only sound was the gentle rustling of the Napa Valley wind moving through the grapevines. Ronan stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake that had just slithered onto his dinner plate. His thick, silver eyebrows pulled together in deep, aggressive irritation. "What kind of pathetic, dramatic stunt is this now, Aveline?" my father barked, his face still flushed a volatile red from his earlier screaming match with Harper. "I just told you to get off my property. We are trying to enjoy a milestone anniversary with respected members of this community, and you are throwing office supplies at us like a petulant child." "Open it," I said flatly, not breaking eye contact with him. My voice did not rise. It remained perfectly level, anchored by the absolute certainty of the truth. If my life is so tragically average, and if my career is just crunching numbers in a cubicle, as Vance so eloquently put it, you should have absolutely no problem explaining the documents inside that envelope to everyone at this table. With a loud huff of sheer, performative annoyance, Ronan snatched the heavy envelope. He aggressively ripped the red tape, tearing the top flap open, and pulled out a thick stack of formal, heavily redacted financial documents. The bold, black text of a finalized commercial lending agreement was printed across the very top page. Ronan adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. I watched carefully as his arrogant, domineering expression began to falter. The deep red flush of anger on his face slowly, agonizingly drained away, replaced by a sudden, tense, sickly pallor. He swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly, causing the crisp papers to rustle loudly in the quiet evening air. Seraphine noticed her father's sudden, dramatic shift in demeanor. She set her champagne flute down on the marble table, her pristine emerald gown rustling as she leaned forward. "What is it, Dad?" Seraphine asked sharply, her perfectly polished facade showing a tiny crack of genuine concern. She shot a venomous glare in my direction. What kind of fake, fabricated garbage did she bring here to ruin our night? Ronan could not answer her. He just stared at the paper, his mouth opening and closing silently. So I decided to answer for him. "That is a finalized commercial mortgage contract," I announced, my voice cutting cleanly through the warm California air, ensuring that every single guest seated at the long table heard me perfectly. A highly aggressive, short-term commercial loan for exactly $1.5 million. It was executed and signed exactly 18 months ago. Seraphine scoffed loudly, rolling her bright blue eyes, desperately trying to regain control of the narrative. "So what?" she snapped, waving her manicured hand dismissively. "Wealthy people leverage their assets all the time, Aveline. It is called smart, high-level finance. Vance does it every single day. You would know that if you actually managed real wealth instead of just denying loans to poor people." "Oh, it is a brilliant financial move," I agreed, offering my younger sister a chilling, entirely unbothered smile, except for two minor details. First, look at the collateral listed on page 3 of that contract, Seraphine. And second, look at the primary borrower. Seraphine snatched the papers from Ronan's frozen, trembling hands. She flipped frantically to the third page, her eyes scanning down to the highlighted section. She frowned in utter confusion, her lips moving silently as she read the legal description of the property. This is the legal parcel number for the Napa estate," Seraphine muttered, looking up at our father, a profound sense of confusion washing over her face. "Dad, why did you take out a $1.5 million loan against the villa? You told me this place was fully paid off 10 years ago." "I didn't," Ronan whispered, his deep voice cracking violently. He slowly turned his head, his wide, terrified eyes locking directly onto his golden son-in-law. "I didn't sign this." "That is exactly right, Ronan," I said, leaning forward and resting my forearms firmly on the marble table. "You didn't take out that loan. Vance did." The silence that followed was entirely different from the silence before. This was not the silence of shock or disbelief. It was the heavy, suffocating, guilty silence of a massive, devastating lie finally being dragged out into the blinding light of day. Vance Sterling, the visionary developer, the man who had just spent the last 2 hours aggressively mansplaining finance to a certified commercial underwriter, froze completely. The smooth, arrogant confidence he had worn like a tailored suit instantly evaporated. A single bead of sweat formed at his temple, sliding slowly down the side of his face. "That's a lie!" Seraphine shrieked, her voice suddenly high-pitched and frantic. She slammed her hands down onto the table, pointing a shaking finger at my face. You are a bitter, jealous little liar, Aveline. Vance is building a multi-million-dollar boutique hotel in Carmel. He has a massive portfolio. He doesn't need to borrow money against my parents' house. Let's talk about that boutique hotel, Seraphine, I countered smoothly, never raising my voice. Let's talk about the Carmel Coastal Retreat that Vance has been bragging about to every single person on this terrace tonight. Let's talk about his visionary risk tolerance. I didn't wait for her to respond. I kept my eyes locked directly on Vance, watching him slowly suffocate under the weight of my words. There is no hotel in Carmel, Vance, I stated, stripping away his illusion with brutal efficiency. There are no exclusive memberships. There is no Michelin star dining concept. The address you list on your glossy investor brochures is a vacant, overgrown dirt lot that you don't even own. The holding company you created to manage the project is a completely empty shell registered to a P.O. box in Delaware. Vance swallowed hard, his chest heaving under his expensive Italian silk tie. You don't understand the developmental phases of commercial real estate, he stammered, his voice losing every ounce of its deep practice polish. It sounded thin, reedy, and desperate. We are in the pre-construction capitalization phase. The funds are securely tied up in land acquisition and architectural retaining fees. You are looking at an incomplete snapshot of a massive corporate structure. I actually laughed. It was a short, sharp sound devoid of any humor. Pre-construction capitalization? I repeated, genuinely astounded by his delusional audacity. Vance, I audited the wire transfers. Every single dime of that one. $5 million was electronically routed into a private, unregulated offshore account within 48 hours of the loan closing. I stood up straight, pacing slowly behind my heavy teakwood chair, commanding the attention of the entire terrace. Beside me, Elias remained perfectly still, his eyes scanning the crowd, watching the wealthy guests rapidly realize that they were attending the funeral of the Kingsford family's reputation. You didn't use that money to buy land, I continued, systematically dismantling his life. You used it as a desperate life raft. You used $400,000 of it to quietly settle a massive, outstanding private gambling debt you racked up in Macau 3 years ago. You used another $300,000 to buy Seraphine that ridiculous emerald gown, the brand new Aston Martin currently parked in the driveway, and to fund her fake high society aesthetic so she wouldn't realize she married a completely broke fraudster. Seraphine gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. No, she whimpered, shaking her head violently, her perfect blonde curls bouncing erratically. No, Vance is incredibly successful. The country club, his investors, everyone knows he is a genius. He is a con artist, Seraphine, I corrected her sharply. He ran out of other people's money to spend, so he leveraged the only tangible asset he had access to. Your parents' fully paid off Napa Valley estate. Ronan looked back and forth between us, his face draining of all remaining color. The arrogant patriarch who had demanded absolute submission just 20 minutes ago was now visibly trembling. What is she saying, Vance? My father demanded, his voice filled with raw, unadulterated panic. He reached across the table and grabbed Vance by the lapel of his expensive suit. Tell her she is lying. Tell me you didn't put a $1.5 million lien on my home. Vance couldn't speak. He was staring at the highlighted commercial mortgage contract on the table as if it were a death warrant. He tried to pull away from Ronan's grip, looking frantically toward the exit, his eyes wide with the sheer terror of a cornered animal. But I wasn't finished. The financial fraud was only the first layer of this toxic onion. The ultimate betrayal was far more intimate. I turned my steady, unforgiving gaze away from the panicking men and locked eyes directly with the grand matriarch of the family. Vivian was sitting completely frozen in her chair at the head of the table. Her posture was rigidly straight, but her hands were gripping the edges of the marble table so tightly that her knuckles were entirely bone white. The heavy ruby pendant around her neck seemed to be physically weighing her down. She was not looking at the documents. She was not looking at Vance or Ronan. She was looking directly at me, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw pure, unmasked terror in my mother's eyes. You didn't act alone, did you, Vance? I asked softly, the silence of the terrace amplifying my words. Vance squeezed his eyes shut, a miserable, defeated sound escaping his throat. What do you mean? Ronan asked, his voice shaking. He dropped his hold on Vance's suit and looked at me, completely lost. What does she mean, Vance? I slowly walked down the side of the table until I was standing directly across from my mother. I leaned over the marble surface, invading her pristine, curated space. A $1.5 million high-interest commercial loan requires massive monthly payments, Dad, I explained, never breaking eye contact with Vivian. Payments that Vance obviously could not make because he had already spent all the money pretending to be a billionaire. So, 6 months ago, the loan went into severe default. Ronan's jaw dropped. Default? 6 months ago? We would have been notified. The bank would have sent letters. They would have called the house. Oh, they did notify you, Ronan, I replied smoothly. The lender sent multiple certified letters. They sent urgent legal notices explicitly stating that the property was entering the preliminary stages of foreclosure. But you never saw them, did you? Ronan frowned, genuine confusion warring with the rising panic in his chest. No, I never saw a single letter from a bank. That's because your loving wife intercepted the mail, I stated, dropping the final, devastating bomb directly onto the center of their 40-year marriage. The wealthy guests seated around the table gasped collectively. Several of the women Vivian had spent years desperately trying to impress covered their mouths in absolute shock. Ronan slowly, mechanically turned his head to look at his wife of 40 years. Vivian, he whispered, his voice completely hollowed out by disbelief. Vivian, what is she talking about? Vivian's perfectly contoured face twisted into an ugly mask of sheer, desperate denial. She shook her head aggressively, the heavy ruby pendant swinging wildly against her chest. She's lying, Ronan, Vivian shrieked, her voice cracking painfully. Aveline has always been insanely jealous of Seraphine. She is just trying to destroy our anniversary because she is a miserable, lonely woman. I never saw any letters. Stop lying, Mother, I commanded, my voice slicing through her pathetic defense like a razor blade. I didn't just trace the money. I tracked the communication logs. I know exactly when the certified letters were signed for at the front gate. You knew. I turned back to Ronan, making sure he understood the absolute, staggering depth of his wife's betrayal. She found out about the massive default 6 months ago, I told him, relishing the complete destruction of their perfect facade. She confronted Vance. But instead of telling you, instead of hiring a lawyer and trying to save the estate, she made a calculated choice. I pointed a firm, accusatory finger directly at my mother. She looked at the reality of the situation. I continued, my tone dripping with absolute disgust. If she told you the truth, you would have publicly ruined Vance. You would have filed police reports. Seraphine's fake, wealthy lifestyle would have completely evaporated overnight. Everyone at the country club would have known that the Kingsford family's golden daughter had married a broke, fraudulent criminal. I leaned closer to Vivian, my voice dropping to a harsh, lethal whisper. You couldn't handle the social embarrassment, could you, Vivian? You cared more about Seraphine maintaining her fake coastal aesthetic on social media than you cared about your own husband's financial security. You chose to protect the illusion. You shoved those certified foreclosure notices into a desk drawer and just prayed Vance would magically find the money to cover it up before the bank seized the house. No! Vivian wailed, burying her face in her hands, her pristine white silk dress suddenly looking utterly ridiculous amidst the explosive hatred and betrayal. Ronan stumbled backward, clutching his chest as if he had just been physically struck. The man who had spent his entire life bullying me, belittling my struggles, and praising Seraphine as the perfect daughter was now standing on his patio, publicly exposed as a massive fool who had been betrayed by the two women he loved most. You hid it from me? Ronan choked out, staring at his wife in sheer horror. You let him put a lien on my home, and you hid it from me just to protect her reputation? Seraphine looked wildly between our parents, her own manicured hands trembling so violently she dropped her champagne flute. It shattered against the flagstone patio, adding to the debris of the evening. Mom, is it true? Seraphine cried out, her voice filled with a terrifying mixture of profound realization and blinding rage. Did you know Vance was completely broke? Did you know my car, my clothes, everything? It was all bought with stolen money? Vivian didn't answer. Her silence was a glaring, undeniable admission of profound guilt. She clutched her ruby pendant, sobbing dramatically, desperately trying to farm sympathy from the wealthy guests who were now actively backing away from the table, completely horrified by the radioactive fallout of the Kingsford family's implosion. But as satisfying as it was to watch them turn on each other like a pack of starving wolves, the absolute worst part of the betrayal had yet to be revealed. They thought the $1.5 million lien was the bottom of the barrel. They had absolutely no idea that the trap they were standing in was far, far deeper. I stepped back, smoothing my dress once more, standing tall next to Elias. The quiet financial investigator adjusted his tie, his eyes fixed firmly on Vance, preparing for the final fatal blow. I know this is incredibly difficult for you to process, Ronan, I said, my voice echoing clearly over the sounds of my mother's frantic weeping and my sister's hysterical panic. But we are not quite finished, because there is one final piece to this puzzle that you haven't realized yet. Ronan looked at me, his eyes wide and completely hollow. What else could there possibly be? He whispered brokenly. He stole the house. She let him. What else is there, Aveline? I reached down to the marble table and tapped a single, perfectly manicured fingernail against the second page of the commercial mortgage contract. You need to ask yourself a very important question, Ronan, I said softly. If Vance is a completely broke fraudster with massive gambling debts and zero actual assets, how did he possibly qualify for a $1.5 million commercial loan? The realization hit the table with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. Vance's face, already pale with terror, somehow turned a sickly shade of ash gray. He slumped back heavily into his teakwood chair, his confident posture completely collapsing. He looked at the heavy leather briefcase resting by Elias's feet, treating it like a live explosive device that was about to detonate. "Tell them, Vance," I commanded, the cold authority in my voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "Tell them exactly whose pristine credit score, whose flawless financial history, and whose stolen social security number you used to secure that massive loan." Vance's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. The smooth, charismatic developer who had spent the entire evening loudly boasting about his visionary genius was now completely paralyzed by the sight of his own forged paperwork. When he couldn't find the courage to confess, Seraphine practically lunged across the marble table. Her emerald gown caught on the edge of her heavy wooden chair, tearing slightly at the seam, but she didn't even notice. She grabbed the second page of the contract, her perfectly manicured fingernails scraping harshly against the thick paper. Her bright blue eyes darted rapidly across the lines of dense legal text, searching for the guarantor's information. She found it highlighted in a neat, unmistakable yellow block. Seraphine's breath hitched. She looked up slowly, her face a portrait of absolute, uncomprehending horror. She stared directly at me. "It's your name," Seraphine whispered, the words trembling as they left her lips. "He used your name, Aveline, and your social security number. And she looked back down at the bottom of the page, her voice dropping to a sickening hollow pitch. "And your signature." "Exactly," I said, my voice carrying a lethal, quiet intensity that cut through the remaining ambient noise of the terrace. The jazz band had long since packed their instruments and fled the immediate vicinity, sensing the explosive legal detonation about to occur. Several of the wealthy guests had also begun quietly slipping away, desperate to avoid being subpoenaed or associated with the spectacular implosion of the Kingsford family. I rested my hands on the back of my chair, looking down at the people who had made my life a living hell for 36 years. "Your brilliant, visionary husband didn't just take out a loan, Seraphine. He committed massive federal identity theft," I stated, enunciating every single syllable with crystal clear precision. "He used my pristine credit score, forged my signature, and illegally attached my social security number to a $1.5 million commercial debt. He strapped me with the financial liability so he could pull cold, hard cash out of this estate to fund his offshore gambling and your luxury lifestyle." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. I fully expected them to turn on Vance. I expected my father to grab him by the throat, or my mother to scream for the authorities. Any normal family would have instantly recognized the severe criminal violation and protected their own flesh and blood. But the absolute worst part about my family was their bottomless well of sheer, unadulterated audacity. The deeply ingrained, toxic hierarchy of the Kingsford family was so absolute that even in the face of federal felonies, their first instinct was to blame the scapegoat. Instead of looking at Vance with disgust, Ronan slowly turned his volatile, bloodshot eyes back toward me. His heavy chest heaved as his panicked brain desperately searched for a way out of this disaster, a way to maintain his illusion of wealth and control, and in his twisted, arrogant mind, he found it. Ronan straightened his posture, desperately trying to project the intimidating corporate authority he had used to crush me when I was a terrified 19-year-old girl. "Well, you can afford it," Ronan growled, his deep voice vibrating with aggressive, unhinged entitlement. I paused. Even after everything I knew about them, the sheer, breathtaking narcissism of his statement actually made me blink. "Excuse me? You heard me, Aveline!" Ronan bellowed, slamming his hand on the marble table, the crystal glasses rattling violently. He pointed a thick, accusatory finger directly at my face. "Do not stand there and act like some innocent victim. You are a highly paid executive. You just bragged about auditing multi-million-dollar portfolios. If you have that kind of money, you can pay off this damn loan. You want me to pay off a $1.5 million fraudulent debt that Vance stole using my stolen identity?" I asked, genuinely astounded by his delusional logic. "Consider it back pay," Vivian suddenly shrieked from the head of the table. My mother had miraculously recovered from her tearful breakdown the moment she realized there was an opportunity to deflect the blame onto me. She stood up, her white silk dress trembling as she braced herself against the sturdy table. Her face was an ugly, blotchy red, completely devoid of the elegant hostess persona she had worn all evening. "Did you really think you could just live off us for free when you were a pregnant, ruined teenager?" Vivian sneered, her voice shrill and vicious, desperately clinging to the only ammunition she had ever possessed against me. "You brought immense shame to this family 17 years ago, Aveline. We let you stay in your bedroom. We paid your medical bills. We bought diapers for that illegitimate child of yours when you had absolutely nothing. We spent years cleaning up the disastrous mess you made of your life so you wouldn't embarrass us in front of our friends." She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at me, her eyes completely wild with desperate justification. "We calculated exactly what you cost us, with interest," Vivian screamed, entirely abandoning any pretense of sanity. "You owe this family. Vance was just utilizing an available family asset to keep this estate afloat. You are entirely obligated to fix this and save our home." I stared at them, letting the pure, toxic madness of their logic wash over me. They had secretly saddled me with a mountain of fraudulent debt. They had actively conspired to steal my financial future. And in their profoundly twisted minds, they were simply collecting a past due invoice for the basic legal requirement of not throwing their pregnant teenage daughter out into the street. They truly believed they owned me. They thought I would just cry, accept the financial ruin, and submit to their absolute authority, sacrificing myself to save Seraphine's lifestyle, just like I always had. "You are completely out of your minds," I said, my voice dropping to a dead, icy whisper. "You will pay it, Aveline," Ronan roared, taking a physically threatening step toward me. "You will write a check, you will clear the lien on my house, and we will handle Vance's discipline internally, as a family. If you refuse, I will call the local police right now and have you arrested for trespassing and causing a violent disturbance. I will destroy whatever pathetic career you have built." Ronan reached into the pocket of his tailored slacks and pulled out his smartphone, holding it up like a weapon. He expected me to flinch. He expected the threat of public humiliation and law enforcement to force me into submission. Instead, I slowly reached out, picked up my glass of sparkling water, and took a long, refreshing sip. The ice clinked softly against the expensive crystal. I swallowed, set the glass down gently on a cork coaster, and folded my hands neatly in front of me. "Go ahead, Ronan," I said calmly. "Dial the number. But before you call the local dispatcher to complain about a family argument, you might want to understand exactly who is standing next to me." I turned my head and gave Elias a brief, confirming nod. The quiet, distinguished man who had been introduced as my +1 stepped forward. He did not yell. He did not posture aggressively like my father. He simply reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy, dark leather wallet. He flipped it open with a sharp snap of his wrist and placed it flat on the marble dining table, right next to the forged commercial mortgage contract. A heavy gold six-pointed star gleamed brightly under the canopy of fairy lights. Next to the badge was a laminated federal identification card. "Elias Bradley," he introduced himself again, his deep voice carrying the absolute, unquestionable weight of government authority. "Senior investigator, State Department of Financial Protection and Innovation, working in joint task force coordination with the FBI's white-collar crime division." The remaining color drained entirely from Ronan's face. His hand, still holding his smartphone in the air, began to tremble so violently he nearly dropped the device. He stared at the gold badge as if it were a loaded gun pointed directly at his chest. Vivian gasped, physically stumbling backward, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. "This isn't a family dispute, mister." Kingsford, Elias stated, his tone flat and entirely devoid of the sympathy my parents were so desperately trying to farm. And it certainly isn't a matter that can be handled internally. You are currently standing in the blast radius of a massive multi-state financial fraud and money laundering investigation. Vance let out a sound that was half sob, half choke. He slumped forward, burying his face in his hands, completely paralyzed by the sheer terror of federal law enforcement. No, wait, Seraphine stammered, her eyes darting wildly between Elias's badge and her panicking husband. This is a mistake. It's just a misunderstanding about a loan. Aveline is my sister. She wouldn't call the authorities on her own family. You can't just arrest people at an anniversary party. I didn't call the authorities today, Seraphine. I corrected her gently, almost pitying her profound ignorance. I stepped around the table, closing the physical distance between us. I haven't been building this case this afternoon. I've been building it for an entire year. I looked down at Vance, watching his shoulders shake. You see, Vance, I began, my voice cold and surgical. When you decided to steal my identity, you made a catastrophic error in judgment. You didn't just pick a random mid-level bank to underwrite your fraudulent $1.5 million loan. You went to a major commercial private equity firm, a firm that specializes in high-yield, high-risk, distressed debt. Vance slowly raised his head from his hands. His eyes were red, completely devoid of his usual arrogance. He looked at me with the dawning, terrifying realization of a man who suddenly understands he walked directly into a trap. 12 months ago, I continued, savoring the absolute destruction of his ego. My firm acquired a massive portfolio of distressed commercial debts from that exact private equity group. I am the senior underwriter who was assigned to audit that specific acquisition. I sit in a corner office, Vance. I review every single piece of high-risk commercial paper that crosses our desks. Seraphine let out a sharp, horrifying gasp. That's right, I said, my eyes locked on Vance. Exactly 1 year ago, I was sitting at my desk drinking my morning coffee, and I opened a file containing a severely defaulted commercial mortgage tied to a non-existent boutique hotel in Carmel. And right there, on page 2, I found my own forged signature. Ronan slumped back into his chair, the absolute finality of the situation crushing the breath out of his lungs. He finally understood that I was not a victim reacting to a sudden crisis. I was the architect of their complete destruction. You knew for a year, Vivian whispered, her voice trembling violently. You knew for an entire year, and you came to our dinners? You smiled at us on holidays while you were secretly plotting to send your sister's husband to prison? I didn't plot anything, Vivian, I replied smoothly. I simply did my job. When a forensic underwriter finds direct evidence of felony identity theft and wire fraud, we are legally obligated by fiduciary duty to report it. So I spent 6 months meticulously tracing every single offshore wire transfer. I pulled the IP addresses Vance used to log into the fraudulent shell accounts. I documented every single dime he siphoned out of this estate to pay for Seraphine's luxury cars and his Macau gambling debts. I paused, letting the immense weight of the evidence sink into their panicked brains. And 6 months ago, I concluded, my voice ringing with total, absolute authority, I handed that entire bulletproof 400-page dossier directly over to Elias and the State Department of Financial Protection. I am not a disgruntled family member, Ronan. I am a fully cooperating, protected federal witness. The words federal witness hit the terrace with the devastating force of a physical blow. The last remaining shred of Vance's Wall Street persona evaporated completely, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, desperate fraudster staring down the barrel of a lengthy prison sentence. We can fix this, Vance muttered frantically, his eyes darting around the patio as if searching for a physical escape route. He abruptly jumped up from his teakwood chair, nearly knocking it over. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his fingers tapping wildly against the screen. I have capital tied up in a secondary holding account. I can liquidate it. I can wire the funds to the firm tomorrow morning. We can clear the lien, Aveline. I can pay you back with interest. Just tell him to drop the investigation. Vance pointed a violently shaking finger at Elias, his breathing rapid and shallow. I have the money. I swear to God, I have the money to fix this. I didn't argue with him. I simply folded my arms across my chest and watched him spiral. Check your banking app, Vance, I suggested quietly. Vance froze. He looked down at the bright screen of his smartphone. He opened his primary banking application, his thumb pressing frantically against the biometric scanner. I watched the exact moment his entire world completely flatlined. His eyes widened to an impossible degree. He tapped the screen again, harder this time, as if physical force could change the digital numbers staring back at him. A choked, guttural sound escaped his throat. "What is it?" Seraphine cried out, rushing to his side and grabbing his arm. "Vance, what does it say? Transfer the money." "It's gone," Vance whispered, his voice completely hollow. He dropped the expensive smartphone onto the marble table. The screen remained illuminated, displaying a stark, terrifying message in bright red text. "Account frozen. Pending federal asset forfeiture." "You can't buy your way out of a federal indictment, Vance," Elias stated, his voice calm and authoritative. "As of 8 a.m. this morning, a federal judge signed a comprehensive asset freeze on every single account tied to your Social Security number, your LLCs, and your offshore holding companies. You don't have capital. You don't have a secondary holding account. You have absolutely nothing." Seraphine looked at the red text on the phone screen, the reality of her husband's absolute ruin finally piercing through her thick layer of coastal chic denial. She was completely destitute. The luxurious bubble she had lived in for 33 years had just violently popped. The emerald gown she was wearing, the Aston Martin in the driveway, the country club memberships, it was all gone. "No!" Seraphine wailed, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with hysterical, uncontrollable sobs. "My life, my friends. Everyone is going to know. You ruined my life, Aveline. You took everything from me." "I didn't take anything that belonged to you, Seraphine," I replied coldly. "You were just playing dress-up with stolen money. It was never your life to begin with." Ronan, who had been sitting in stunned, paralyzed silence, suddenly pushed himself up from his chair. The arrogant patriarch was entirely broken. He looked at the frozen bank accounts, the federal badge on the table, and the forged commercial mortgage contract that still bore the legal parcel number of his beloved Napa Valley estate. "The house," Ronan croaked, his voice cracking painfully. He looked at me, tears of pure terror finally welling up in his eyes. He abandoned his anger, instantly reverting to desperate, pathetic pleading. "Aveline, please, if his accounts are frozen and the loan has been in default for 6 months, what happens to the villa? They can't take the estate. It's our home. It's our 40-year legacy." He crawled forward slightly, reaching out as if he wanted to grab the hem of my dress. "You have to use your connections at the firm, Aveline. You have to tell them we were victims of fraud. They have to give us an extension. We can sell the cars. We can liquidate Vivian's jewelry. We just need time to negotiate with the bank." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the pathetic man begging at my feet. 10 years ago, his tears might have manipulated me. 10 years ago, the intense guilt-tripping about family legacy would have absolutely crushed my resolve. But I was no longer the frightened girl desperate for his approval. I was a surgeon, and the tumor was finally completely excised. I took a slow, deliberate breath, preparing to deliver the final, fatal twist of the knife. They thought the federal investigation was the worst thing that was going to happen tonight. They thought the bank was going to take their house in a few months after a long, drawn-out legal battle. They were so completely, tragically wrong. "You don't need to negotiate with the bank, Ronan," I said smoothly, my voice dropping to a calm, icy register that sent a visible shiver down his spine. "Why not?" Ronan pleaded, his eyes wide and frantic. "If we show them the fraud evidence? Because the bank doesn't own the debt anymore," I interrupted him, stepping closer to the table, ensuring my absolute authority commanded the space. "And neither does the private equity firm." Vivian dropped her hands from her face, her ruined, tear-streaked makeup making her look like a terrifying ghost of her former self. "Then who owns it?" she shrieked. "Who holds the lien on our house?" I reached into my unbranded leather tote bag one final time. I didn't pull out an envelope or a binder. I pulled out a single, heavy, crisp sheet of specialized legal paper. It bore the embossed gold seal of the state of California, signed and notarized by a superior court judge. I held it up so the canopy of fairy lights caught the gold seal. When Vance defaulted 6 months ago, the private equity firm initiated judicial foreclosure proceedings, I explained, my tone strictly professional, as if I were delivering a routine boardroom presentation. They didn't want the hassle of a long legal battle. They wanted to offload the toxic, distressed debt immediately. I looked directly into Ronan's terrified eyes. "So, they sold the promissory note at a severe discount to a private, anonymous, limited liability company," I continued. The LLC purchased the debt entirely in cash, assuming all rights as the sole lien holder of the Kingsford estate. And because Vivian actively hid the court summons and the notices of default, the LLC won a summary default judgment. An LLC? Ronan whispered, his brain struggling to comprehend the complex legal maneuvering. Who owns the LLC? I didn't answer him with words. I simply placed the heavy, notarized document flat onto the marble table, directly over the shattered glass of Oliver's broken water goblet. It was a finalized deed of trust and order of eviction. At the very bottom of the document, listed boldly as the sole managing member of the purchasing LLC and the new absolute legal owner of the Napa Valley estate, was a single name: Aveline Kingsford. Ronan's eyes remained locked on the thick, notarized paper resting on the marble table. He read my name once, twice, and then a third time, as if his brain simply refused to process the alphabetical arrangement of the letters. The silence that blanketed the terrace was absolute. The gentle California breeze moving through the Napa vineyard seemed to hold its breath. Even the crickets had gone completely quiet. You? Ronan finally choked out. The word barely had enough air behind it to carry across the shattered glass. He looked up at me, his large, imposing frame suddenly appearing frail and shrunken inside his expensive suit. You bought the debt? I didn't just buy the debt, Ronan. I corrected him smoothly, my voice echoing with the quiet, devastating authority of absolute ownership. I bought the promissory note 6 months ago. When Vivian continued to ignore the legal summons, the court granted my LLC a default judgment. I foreclosed on the property. Sometime around 9 a.m. this morning, a Superior Court judge signed the final execution of the deed. I own the vineyards. I own the villa. I own every single blade of grass you are currently standing on. Vivian let out a high, thin, reedy sound, like a balloon slowly losing air. She collapsed back into her chair, her manicured hands gripping the armrest so tightly, her knuckles turned a stark, translucent white. How? Vivian whispered, her voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of shock and sheer, unadulterated revulsion. She looked at my practical, unbranded dress and my simple jewelry, unable to reconcile her perception of me with the financial reality unfolding before her eyes. How could you possibly afford a $1.5 million commercial note in cash? You're just an underwriter. You drive a normal car. You don't have this kind of wealth. I looked at the woman who had spent 36 years measuring my worth entirely by the brand names in my closet. That is exactly why I have this kind of wealth, Vivian, I replied, stripping away her lifelong delusion with cold, surgical precision. For 17 years, you and Ronan mocked me. You sat around drinking expensive imported wine, laughing at the boring daughter who drove a reliable SUV and wore quiet, tailored clothes. You genuinely believed I was struggling because I chose not to waste my money on leased Aston Martins, designer emerald gowns, or fake social media aesthetics. I stepped slightly to the right, placing myself at the absolute physical head of the table, effectively dethroning both of them in a single, fluid movement. What you completely fail to understand, I continued, letting my words sink deep into their panicked minds, is that being a highly successful senior underwriter in the commercial sector pays incredibly well. And because I don't spend my wealth pretending to be a billionaire, I actually have liquid capital. The kind of liquid capital that allows someone to purchase a foreclosed estate for pennies on the dollar entirely in cash. Seraphine, who was still clutching her ruined emerald gown and sobbing into her hands, suddenly snapped her head up. Her tear-streaked face was a twisted mask of blinding, unhinged rage. Her golden pedestal had not just cracked, it had been pulverized into dust. "You stole our house!" Seraphine shrieked, her voice cracking painfully as it echoed across the empty flagstone terrace. "You planned this. You purposely bought the debt just so you could kick our parents out onto the street. You are a sick, vindictive monster, Aveline. You ruined my husband's business, and now you are stealing my inheritance." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked at my younger sister with profound, absolute apathy. "I didn't steal anything, Seraphine," I stated, my tone as hard and unforgiving as the marble table between us. "You cannot steal a property that was already legally forfeited due to severe federal fraud. I simply recognized a highly profitable real estate investment and executed a flawless corporate acquisition. You kicking yourselves out of this estate by committing felony identity theft was just a highly convenient personal bonus. It's not a business acquisition, Ronan roared, finally finding a desperate, volatile surge of adrenaline. He slammed his fist down on the table, trying to use physical intimidation to regain control. This is a family. We are your blood. You cannot legally do this to us. I will hire the best defense attorneys in the state. I will tie this LLC up in civil litigation for a decade. You will never step foot inside this house as the owner. Before I could even respond to his pathetic threat, Elias stepped forward. The federal investigator didn't look angry. He looked entirely bored by Ronan's predictable outburst. You aren't going to be hiring anyone, Mr. Kingsford, Elias noted dryly, adjusting the lapels of his suit jacket. Civil litigation requires capital that you no longer possess. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted communication device. He pressed a single button and spoke clearly into the microphone. Perimeter secure. All guests have vacated the immediate zone. Bring the teams in. At first, there was only silence. Then, the distinct, heavy crunch of thick rubber tires rolling over the gravel driveway broke the quiet of the Napa evening. It wasn't the screaming, chaotic wail of local police sirens. White-collar federal raids don't announce themselves with flashing red and blue lights to alert the neighbors. They are quiet, methodical, and absolutely devastating. 3 massive, heavily tinted black SUVs turned off the main access road and rolled smoothly up the long, circular driveway, parking with military precision behind Vance's leased Aston Martin. The heavy doors opened in perfect synchronization. Over a dozen individuals stepped out onto the pristine driveway. They were not wearing standard police uniforms. They wore dark, tailored suits, dark sunglasses, and prominent lanyards displaying federal identification badges. Accompanying them were 4 private security contractors wearing tactical vests adorned with the logo of a premier corporate receivership firm. "What is this?" Vivian gasped, her hands flying to her throat, her heavy ruby pendant practically choking her as she watched the agents fan out across the manicured lawn. "Ronan, who are these people?" "That," Elias announced, his voice carrying the finality of a judge's gavel, "is the Federal Asset Forfeiture and Receivership Team." The lead agent, a tall woman with steel gray hair and an entirely unreadable expression, walked briskly up the stone steps to the terrace. She flashed her credentials at Elias, who gave her a brief nod. "Vance Sterling?" the lead agent asked, her eyes immediately locking onto the sweating, trembling developer sitting at the table. Vance couldn't speak. He just stared at the armed federal agents surrounding his wife's anniversary party. "We are executing a comprehensive search and seizure warrant regarding all physical and digital assets tied to Sterling Development, LLC, and its subsidiaries," the agent stated loudly, reading from a thick legal document. "Furthermore, we are impounding the 2024 Aston Martin currently parked in the driveway, as it was purchased using directly traceable, illicitly obtained wire funds." Seraphine let out a raw, guttural scream. "No, that is my car. My husband bought that for me." She lunged out of her chair, her emerald gown catching on the teakwood armrest and tearing completely down the side. She didn't care. She sprinted toward the edge of the terrace, desperately trying to physically block the federal agents from approaching her prized luxury vehicle. "Ma'am, step back immediately," a secondary agent warned, placing a firm, unyielding hand on her shoulder, physically restraining her from interfering with the impound process. Seraphine thrashed against the agent's grip, her perfectly styled blonde hair falling into her tear-soaked face. She turned wildly toward her husband, who was still sitting frozen at the marble table. "Vance, do something!" Seraphine shrieked, her voice bordering on complete hysteria. "Tell them they are making a mistake. Tell them you have the money. Don't just sit there and let them take my car." But Vance Sterling was entirely out of moves. The arrogant, slick-talking developer had run out of other people's money to spend, and he had run out of lies to tell. He slumped forward, resting his forehead against the cold marble table, letting out a pathetic, broken sob. The golden couple's perfect, wealthy marriage was officially disintegrating in real time. Seraphine stared at her sobbing husband, the absolute terror of impending poverty finally overriding her shock. In that exact moment, the profound, unconditional love she constantly bragged about on social media completely died. Like a cornered rat on a rapidly sinking ship, the golden child immediately looked for someone else to throw overboard to save her own skin. Seraphine violently ripped her arm away from the federal agent and marched back toward the dining table. She didn't look at me. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at Vance's face. "This is all your fault," Seraphine hissed, her voice dripping with venomous hatred. You lied to me. You told me business was booming. You told me that boutique hotel was a gold mine. Vance slowly lifted his head. His eyes were red, swollen, and filled with a dark, terrifying resentment. The charismatic charm was gone, replaced by the cornered desperation of a man facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I lied to you, Vance spat, his voice raspy and bitter. He let out a loud, manic laugh that bordered on completely unhinged. You demanded every single penny of it, Seraphine. Do not stand there and play the innocent victim. You knew my development fund was struggling months ago, but you absolutely refused to cut back on your ridiculous, lavish lifestyle. That is a complete fabrication, Seraphine shrieked, her face turning an ugly shade of blotchy red. I thought you were a genius. I trusted you to provide for me. Provide for you? Vance roared, slamming his hands down on the table, finally exploding under the pressure. You are a complete parasite. Do you know how much that country club membership costs? Do you know how much I had to steal just to keep up the fake wealthy aesthetic you are so desperately obsessed with? You pitched an absolute fit, locked yourself in the bedroom, and refused to speak to me until I agreed to buy you that ridiculous Aston Martin, Vivian gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. Vance, lower your voice this instant. You are making a horrific scene. But Vance completely ignored my mother. He was entirely consumed by his own panic, determined to drag his wife down into the flames with him. I took your sister's mortgage money just to keep the lights on and pay for your designer handbags, Seraphine, Vance continued, his voice echoing violently across the vineyards. I did it for you, and you knew exactly where that money came from. Seraphine froze. The manic, defensive anger instantly drained from her face, replaced by a sudden, stark, terrifying pallor. She glanced nervously at Elias and the federal agents standing nearby, her eyes wide with sudden panic. Shut up, Vance, Seraphine whispered, her voice trembling. Shut your mouth right now. I didn't know anything about a forged loan. Oh, really? Vance sneered, his lips curling into a vicious, unforgiving smile. He reached down and picked up his smartphone from the table. The screen still glowed with the red, frozen account warning, but he swiped it away, opening a heavily encrypted secondary folder. You're going to stand there in front of the feds and pretend you're just a naive little housewife? Vance, don't do this, Seraphine pleaded, her voice cracking. She actually took a step backward, terrified of the device in his hands. If I'm going down for federal wire fraud, sweetheart, Vance said, his thumb hovering over an audio file, I am absolutely not going down alone. He pressed play. The audio recording was crystal clear, capturing a conversation that had taken place inside the very walls of this Napa Valley estate exactly 18 months ago. At first, there was only the sound of a television playing softly in the background. Then, Seraphine's highly distinct whining voice filled the quiet terrace. I don't understand why we have to use Aveline's name. It's so risky, Vance. What if the bank calls her? The recorded version of Vance let out a heavy, irritated sigh. They won't call her, Sarah. It's a commercial note, fully automated through my holding company. I just need a guarantor with a Tier 1 credit score to push it through underwriting. Your parents' credit is completely maxed out and mine is tied up. Aveline is the only option to save the house and get the liquid cash for your car. There was a brief pause on the recording. A rhythmic tapping sound echoed from the speaker, the sound of long acrylic nails drumming nervously against a glass table. Fine, Seraphine's recorded voice sighed, dripping with profound irritation, but I am not signing the actual paperwork. Sarah, I need you to forge the signature, Vance's recorded voice pleaded urgently. You grew up with her. You know exactly how she loops her A and crosses her T. If I do it, the bank's fraud detection software might flag the discrepancy in the pen stroke pressure. You can copy it perfectly from the old birthday cards she sent. The live version of Seraphine let out a horrifying, strangled gasp, covering her ears with her hands, but the recording kept playing loudly, ensuring every single federal agent on the terrace heard the undeniable confession. Ugh, this is so annoying, Seraphine's recorded voice complained bitterly. My manicurist is going to literally kill me if I smudge this new gel set just trying to copy her stupid, boring handwriting. Give me the pen, but if I break a nail doing this, you are buying me those diamond earrings to make up for it. The recording clicked off, plunging the terrace back into a heavy, suffocating silence. The betrayal was absolute. It wasn't just Vance. The golden child, the sister who had spent her entire life looking down on me, mocking my clothes, and bragging about her inherent superiority, had actively, maliciously forged my signature to steal my identity simply because she wanted a new luxury car. She had sold my financial future, and her biggest concern was smudging her nail polish. Seraphine stood completely paralyzed, her eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror. She looked at Elias. She looked at the federal agents who were now stepping slowly toward her, pulling heavy steel handcuffs from their tactical belts. That's a fake recording, Seraphine stammered, her voice barely a whisper, backing away until she hit the edge of the marble table. It's AI. He manipulated it. I would never... Save it for the federal prosecutor, Mrs. Sterling, Elias said, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. He gestured to the two agents standing nearest to her. Take her into custody. Read them both their rights. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping tightly around Seraphine's wrists echoed loudly across the manicured lawn. It was the definitive sound of her fake empire completely crumbling into dust. Mom! Seraphine shrieked, bursting into hysterical tears as the agent forcefully spun her around, pressing her chest flat against the edge of the marble table to secure the cuffs. Mom, do something! Dad, help me! They can't take me to prison. I can't survive in a prison. Ronan stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing silently. The wealthy patriarch who had demanded absolute submission from his family for 40 years was completely powerless. He could not yell or bully his way out of a joint federal task force indictment. He watched, utterly destroyed, as his perfect golden daughter was treated like a common street criminal on his own back patio. Vivian, however, completely lost her mind. Let her go, Vivian screamed, abandoning all pretense of high society elegance. She rushed forward, grabbing the arm of the federal agent holding Seraphine. She didn't know what she was doing. Vance manipulated her. You can't arrest her. She's a Kingsford. Do you know who we are? Ma'am, if you do not step back immediately, you will be charged with assaulting a federal officer and obstruction of justice, the lead agent barked, physically shoving Vivian back with a firm professional shove. Your daughter is under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. Step away. Vivian stumbled backward, her expensive white silk dress catching the edge of a stray teakwood chair. She collapsed heavily onto the flagstone patio, scraping her knee, her pristine appearance completely ruined. She looked up at me, her face a mask of pure, unhinged desperation. Aveline! Vivian cried out, tears streaming through her heavy makeup. She actually reached a hand out toward me, begging the daughter she had emotionally abused for 36 years. Aveline, please, tell them you authorized it. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. You can't let them take your sister away in handcuffs. I looked down at my mother, kneeling in the dirt, begging me to sacrifice my own safety, my own career, and my own freedom just to protect the sister who had maliciously forged my name. Even now, facing the absolute destruction of their lives, I was still just a human shield to them. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water, the ice clinking softly against the glass. I can't help you, Vivian, I said, my voice eerily calm and entirely detached. I'm just the scapegoat. I lack the proper genetic foundation to understand complex legal misunderstandings. Vivian let out a guttural, agonizing wail of pure defeat. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably on the dirty patio stones, realizing that the protective barrier I had built around myself was absolutely impenetrable. The federal agents hauled Seraphine and Vance away. The golden couple, who had arrived at the anniversary party in a multi-million-dollar Aston Martin, were now being forcefully marched down the long paved driveway, their hands cuffed tightly behind their backs. They were shoved into the back of separate, heavily tinted black SUVs. The doors slammed shut with a heavy, definitive thud, and the vehicles immediately reversed course, tires crunching over the gravel as they sped away toward a federal holding facility. The chaotic, screaming spectacle was over. The federal raid had concluded its primary objective, but the evening was not finished. The local receivership team, 4 heavily built men wearing dark tactical vests, remained standing on the terrace. They were not there for Vance or Seraphine. They were there to execute the final stage of the legal trap I had meticulously set. I turned my attention back to the dining table. Ronan was still standing there, staring blankly at the empty space where his golden daughter had just been handcuffed. His chest heaved with ragged, shallow breaths. He looked 10 years older than he had an hour ago. The fight had completely drained out of him, leaving behind nothing but a broken, terrified shell of a man. I raised my left arm, pulling back the sleeve of my dress to reveal a slim, silver watch. I tapped the glass face with my index finger, making sure Ronan was paying absolute attention to the ticking time. The grand illusion had been shattered. The criminals had been arrested. It was finally time to clean house. The flashing red and blue lights of the local police cruisers were notably absent. The departure of the federal agents with Seraphine and Vance had been executed with the swift, terrifying efficiency characteristic of white-collar task forces. The driveway was suddenly very empty, save for my dark SUV idling near the gates and the heavy tactical vehicles belonging to the private receivership team. I stood at the head of the ruined anniversary table, looking down at the two people who were responsible for my existence, and consequently responsible for every ounce of suffering I had endured for the first 2 decades of my life. Ronan was slumped against the marble, his breathing ragged and shallow. Vivienne was still on the ground, her pristine white silk dress stained with dirt and spilled wine, weeping softly into her hands. They were entirely, unequivocally broken. I raised my left arm, pulling back the sleeve of my dress to reveal my slim silver watch. I tapped the glass face with my index finger. The sharp clink of my nail against the glass made Ronan flinch. "The federal raid is over, Ronan," I announced, my voice dropping to a low, uncompromising register that left absolutely no room for negotiation. "But the civil execution of my deed is just beginning. You are currently trespassing on private property owned by my LLC. Ronan slowly lifted his head, his bloodshot eyes completely devoid of the arrogant patriarch who had demanded my absolute submission just an hour ago. "Aveline," he rasped, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "Where are we supposed to go? Our accounts. Vance said everything is frozen. We don't have anywhere to go." "That is a logistical issue that you will have to solve on your own," I replied, feeling absolutely zero pity for the man who had once told a 19-year-old girl she was a parasitic drain on his finances. "I am going to offer you a single, entirely non-negotiable choice. You have exactly 60 minutes to pack whatever fits in your remaining vehicle and leave my property forever." Vivienne gasped, her head snapping up from her hands. 60 minutes? This is a 10,000 square foot estate. We have 40 years of our lives in this house. "You have 60 minutes, I repeated, enunciating every single syllable with crystal clear precision. "You may take your personal clothing, your basic toiletries, and whatever small, insignificant personal items you can physically carry. You will not take any furniture. You will not take any artwork. You will not take the imported rugs, the crystal, or the electronics. Those assets now belong to the LLC to offset the massive fraudulent debt your son-in-law incurred and you actively conspired to hide." Ronan opened his mouth to protest, but I immediately cut him off, my tone slicing through the warm Napa air like a razor blade. "If you argue," I warned him, "if you try to negotiate, or if you take 1 minute longer than the allotted hour, the receivership team will physically remove you from the premises with nothing but the clothes currently on your backs. Furthermore, if you attempt to smuggle out any high-value assets, jewelry, watches, or bearer bonds, I will personally press criminal charges for theft of corporate property. The clock starts right now. I highly suggest you stop crying and start packing." Ronan stared at my silver watch as if it were a ticking bomb. The remaining shreds of his pride, the toxic masculinity and overbearing authority he had used to control this family for decades, instantly evaporated. His knees buckled slightly as he pushed himself up from the table. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten me with lawyers anymore. He simply reached down, grabbed Vivienne by the arm, and hauled his weeping wife up from the dirty flagstone. They did not walk into the lavish Mediterranean villa with the arrogant swagger they usually possessed. They scurried. They scrambled up the stone steps and threw open the heavy glass patio doors like desperate rats fleeing a sinking ship. I slowly followed them up the steps, standing in the grand doorway alongside Elias and the lead receivership contractor, to watch the complete and utter collapse of their carefully curated kingdom. There were no professional movers waiting to carefully wrap their expensive belongings. There were no sturdy cardboard moving boxes. Ronan sprinted into the massive designer kitchen, frantically tearing open the lower wooden cabinets until he found a brand new roll of heavy-duty black plastic contractor garbage bags. He ripped 2 bags off the roll and tossed one directly at Vivienne's chest. They ran upstairs to the sprawling master suite. I stayed on the first floor, standing in the grand foyer listening to the chaotic sounds echoing through the high vaulted ceilings. I heard the violent scraping of wooden hangers sliding rapidly across metal closet rods. I heard the frantic thud of heavy boots and expensive Italian leather shoes being blindly tossed across the polished hardwood floors. I heard my mother cursing loudly, her voice cracking as she carelessly swept her everyday cosmetics off her marble vanity and directly into a plastic sack. Less than 20 minutes later, Ronan came stumbling down the grand, sweeping staircase. The wealthy patriarch was sweating profusely, his expensive dress shirt completely untucked, wrinkled, and soaked with dark patches of perspiration. He was dragging 2 massive black garbage bags behind him. The heavy bags bumped awkwardly against the polished oak stairs, making a pathetic, hollow thumping sound with every single step. He dragged the heavy bags right past me, his eyes glued firmly to the floor, entirely unable to look me in the face. He hauled them out the large mahogany front door and down the paved circular driveway toward his least practical daily driver sedan, the only vehicle not impounded by the feds. I watched through the large front windows as he forcefully popped the trunk and began aggressively shoving the heavy black bags inside, crushing his expensive suits to make them fit. Vivian followed shortly after him. My mother, who had spent the entire evening complaining that my son's blue shirt was ruining her elegant coastal neutral aesthetic, was now carrying her own life in a trash bag. She had stuffed armfuls of custom-tailored linen outfits and designer blouses directly into the cheap black plastic. She looked absolutely feral. Her perfect blonde updo had completely collapsed, leaving damp strands of hair clinging to her sweaty forehead. Her expensive makeup was a ruined, smeared mess. She struggled under the heavy weight of the plastic bags, her breathing ragged, loud, and desperately labored. 30 minutes left, I called out clearly as she crossed the grand foyer. She stopped for a fraction of a second, shooting me a look of pure, concentrated venom. But she did not dare say a single word in retaliation. She knew perfectly well that if she wasted even 1 minute arguing, the heavily armed contractor standing right behind me would physically throw her out the door. She lowered her head and kept walking, dragging her ruined wardrobe out to join my struggling father. They ran back and forth from the massive house to the sedan 3 more times, their breathing growing heavier with each desperate trip. The pristine illusion of their vast, unshakable wealth was now physically reduced to a pile of literal trash bags crammed tightly into the back seat and trunk of a mid-sized car. The expensive Napa Valley estate, with its infinite vineyards and imported fixtures, was officially empty of their toxic presence. They were leaving exactly as they had treated me for 36 years, like garbage. The receivership team leader checked his heavy-duty watch and stepped out onto the front porch. "Time is up," he announced firmly. "You need to vacate this property immediately." Ronan had to physically push a bag of Vivian's shoes out of the way just to force himself into the driver's seat of the cramped sedan. He slammed the heavy car door shut, burying his face behind the steering wheel, completely unresponsive to the legal reality unfolding around him. Vivian walked around to the passenger side. She paused for a moment, her hand resting on the metal door handle. She looked back at the sprawling villa, her eyes scanning the grand balconies, the tall glass windows, and the pristine vineyards sitting peacefully in the twilight. It was the exact moment she truly realized she was never stepping foot inside this beautiful house ever again. Her entire 40-year legacy was completely erased. I walked slowly down the front stone steps, stopping right at the edge of the driveway. I needed to witness the absolute finality of their departure to ensure my mind fully processed the fact that I was finally, truly free. Vivian slowly turned her head and looked directly at me. Through the warm California air, our eyes met for the very last time. There was no sadness in her gaze. There was no regret for the terrible things she had said to my adopted son, nor any remorse for the massive fraud she had conspired to cover up. There was only pure, unadulterated, venomous hatred. She hated me because I was the one who survived. She hated me because the scapegoat she had always treated like dirt was now the sole, undisputed owner of her entire kingdom. She expected me to gloat. She expected me to hurl insults or scream victorious profanities at her, to finally stoop to her level of emotional immaturity. But I didn't need to lower myself to her toxic level. I had already won the only battle that actually mattered. I stood tall on my newly acquired manicured lawn, raised my right hand, and gave her a single, cheerful, completely unbothered wave goodbye. Vivian's face twisted in pure, agonizing fury. She violently ripped the passenger door open, threw herself into the front seat, and slammed the heavy door shut. Ronan aggressively started the engine. The sedan reversed awkwardly out of the long circular driveway, its tires crunching loudly over the gravel. Without a single backward glance, the car accelerated down the quiet access road, disappearing completely around the bend, leaving my property entirely silent, peaceful, and finally safe. I stood at the edge of the driveway for a long time, just staring at the empty road. The dense cloud of gravel dust slowly settled back down onto the pavement. For the first time all day, my heart rate began to slow to a normal, steady rhythm. The massive adrenaline spike that had carried me through the confrontation was finally beginning to ebb, leaving behind a profound sense of absolute clarity. Elias walked over to me, snapping his heavy briefcase shut. He looked down the empty street and then back at me, his expression softening just a fraction from his strict professional demeanor. "The perimeter is entirely secure, Evelyn," Elias said quietly. "My team will finish inventorying the interior assets, and the receivership contractors will change the biometric locks on all the exterior doors before midnight. It's officially yours." I turned to him, offering a genuine, deeply grateful smile. "Thank you, Elias, for everything, for keeping the timeline perfectly strict and for making sure my sister didn't manage to talk her way out of those handcuffs." Elias offered a rare, genuine smile in return. "It was the highlight of my fiscal quarter. Enjoy your new home, Aveline. You've more than earned it." He gave me a brief nod, walked over to his own unmarked federal vehicle, and drove quietly down the driveway, leaving me standing alone in front of the massive Mediterranean estate. I turned around and began walking back toward the villa. Without the loud jazz music, the boasting of fraudulent developers, and the frantic scrambling of ruined narcissists, the property felt completely different. The oppressive, suffocating energy that my mother had always projected onto this house was entirely gone. As I walked around the side of the house and stepped back onto the large flagstone terrace, the sudden silence was almost deafening. But it wasn't an empty, lonely silence. It was a rich, peaceful, profoundly healing silence. I could hear the gentle rustling of the wind moving through the high branches of the oak trees. I could smell the crushed grapes and the warm earth without the lingering stench of fake designer perfume. It was the exact scent of complete, absolute victory. I bypassed the ruined dining table entirely and headed straight down the paved pathway toward the heavy iron exit gates, where I had parked my vehicle nearly 3 hours ago. My dark SUV sat exactly where I had left it, safely locked and insulated from the absolute chaos that had just unfolded. As I approached the driver's side door, I could see the faint glow of a digital screen illuminating the interior. I pulled my keys from my pocket and pressed the unlock button. The electronic chirp echoed loudly in the quiet evening air. I pulled the heavy armored door open. A blast of cool air conditioning hit my face. Harper was sitting in the front passenger seat, her long legs curled up comfortably underneath her. Little Oliver was securely strapped into his car seat in the back, happily tapping away at a colorful puzzle game on his iPad. They both looked up the second the door opened. Harper immediately dropped her phone into her lap, her dark eyes wide and searching my face for any sign of distress. She had spent her entire childhood watching me return from family interactions looking completely drained, defeated, and emotionally broken. "Are they gone?" Harper asked, her voice tight with lingering anxiety. I leaned into the car, resting my hands on the steering wheel, and offered her the most genuine, unburdened smile I had ever given anyone. "Yes," I answered softly. "They are gone." "Forever?" Harper asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Forever," I confirmed. Harper let out a massive, shuddering breath, her shoulders dropping 2 inches as the intense tension finally left her young body. I unbuckled her seatbelt, reached across the center console, and pulled her into a tight, fierce hug. I buried my face in her dark hair, breathing in her familiar scent. "You were so incredibly brave today, Harper," I whispered against her shoulder. "You stood up to people who have bullied me my entire life. You protected your little brother when the adults who were supposed to love him completely failed. You did what I was too terrified to do at your age, and I am so unbelievably proud of you." Harper squeezed me back just as tightly. "I was so scared they were going to hurt you, Mom," she murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I couldn't just sit there and let her say those awful things about Oliver. It wasn't right." I pulled back and cupped her face in my hands. "It was absolutely wrong," I agreed firmly. "And because you had the courage to speak up, they will never, ever be allowed to speak to either of you like that again." I reached into the spacious back seat and gently ruffled Oliver's dark hair. He looked up from his glowing screen and gave me a bright, gap-toothed smile. completely unaware of the massive toxic shift that had just occurred on his behalf. "How are you doing back there, buddy?" I asked him. "I'm hungry," Oliver announced simply, making both Harper and me laugh out loud. It was a beautiful, deeply healing sound. "Well, we have a lot of excellent food waiting for us," I promised him. "But first, I have a massive surprise for both of you." I stepped back from the SUV and gestured broadly toward the sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate sitting quietly at the end of the driveway. The massive windows were glowing warmly in the twilight. Harper followed my gaze, her forehead wrinkling in deep confusion. "Mom, what are you talking about? We can't go back in there. They'll call the police." I smiled again, a bright, triumphant grin that reached all the way to my eyes. "The police already came and went, sweetie," I told her. "Vivian doesn't live here anymore, and neither do Ronan, Seraphine, or Vance." Harper's jaw dropped. She looked from me to the massive house and back again. "Then whose house is it?" she whispered, stepping slowly out onto the paved driveway. I reached out and grabbed her hand, pulling her gently forward. "It's ours," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. "I bought it. We are going to change the locks, throw away all those terrible decorations, and completely start over. Come on. Let's go inside right now and pick out your amazing new bedrooms." Walking through those heavy mahogany doors that evening was the true beginning of our real lives. Looking back on that chaotic anniversary weekend, I realized that the true victory was not just about acquiring a massive piece of commercial real estate. The real triumph was finally stepping out of the rigid, suffocating role that my parents had assigned to me since childhood. In every highly toxic family structure, they need the scapegoat to stay securely at the bottom so they can comfortably stand on your shoulders and pretend they are at the top. They do not target you because you are inherently weak. They target you because you possess the profound inner strength and fierce resilience that they completely lack. But here's the most critical lesson I learned through this entire grueling ordeal. Emotional boundaries are absolutely necessary, but sometimes emotional boundaries are simply not enough to stop truly toxic individuals. When you are dealing with people who feel completely entitled to your life, your energy, and your hard-earned resources, you cannot just ask them nicely to respect your personal space. Sometimes you have to establish hard boundaries that carry severe, undeniable legal weight. My parents believed that sharing DNA gave them a permanent, unconditional free pass to conspire in massive federal fraud. They shamelessly weaponized the concept of family to justify absolute criminal behavior. It took a team of armed federal agents, a finalized legal eviction notice, and the very real execution of a commercial deed to finally make them understand that my financial and emotional resources were completely off limits. If you are listening to this right now and you are currently trapped in a similar vicious cycle of family abuse, I need you to hear this loud and clear. You do not owe your abusers your future just because they happen to be physically present in your past. You do not have to set yourself on fire simply to keep your toxic family members warm. If they are secretly draining your bank accounts, ruining your credit score, or actively sabotaging your mental health, you have every single right to use the full extent of the legal system to aggressively protect yourself and your children. You are completely allowed to freeze your credit, change your physical locks, hire a ruthless attorney, and forcefully evict them from your life. The intense guilt they try to make you feel is just another calculated manipulation tactic designed to keep you firmly under their thumb. When you finally stop playing their twisted game, they will call you selfish. They will call you cruel and ungrateful. Let them talk. The peace you will find in your own quiet, safe home is worth infinitely more than the conditional approval of people who only love you when you are actively suffering for their personal benefit. You deserve a life where you are completely respected, valued, and celebrated for exactly who you are. You deserve a home that feels like a warm, safe sanctuary, not an active emotional war zone where you have to constantly defend your right to exist. I look at Oliver and Harper today, thriving in an environment built on absolute trust and mutual respect. And I know that walking away was the greatest gift I could have ever given them. We finally broke the generational cycle. Blood makes you related. Loyalty, respect, and fundamental human decency make you family. If they steal your peace, evict them from your life. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If this resonated with you, or if you believe in taking your power back from toxic situations, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to have you as part of our community. Would you like me to help you brainstorm some engaging YouTube video titles or thumbnail concepts to match this completed story?